Standards Customer Council. My name is Tracy Berardi, and I am Program Manager of the Cloud Council. Today we're going to discuss the Security for Cloud Computing 10 Steps to Ensure Success white paper. Version 2.0 of the paper has just been published. It's available on our website, and it includes numerous updates. I would like to introduce you to Mr. John Meegan, Claude Baudoin, Chris Dotson, Mike Edwards, and Shamoun Mahmoud as contributors to the paper and today's expert speakers. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to pose a question, please use the questions box at the bottom right of the GoToWebinar toolbar. And with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to you, John Meegan. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. So as Tracy mentioned, the topic of our talk today is the Security for Cloud Computing white paper that was actually originally published back in August of 2012. And over the past several months, the team has been working on the version 2 update, which is now available for free on the CSEC website at the URL that is posted at the bottom of the chart. And so on our talk today, we will take you through the guidance and strategies provided in the paper that's targeted at decision makers within cloud customer organizations. So, you know, the primary goal of the paper is to help customers evaluate and compare security offerings from different cloud providers. But before we jump into the details of the paper itself, what I'd like to do first is provide, you know, just a little background on the CSEC itself. So Tracy, if we can move to the next chart. So the CSEC is a customer advocacy organization that provides guidance and levies requirements on cloud standards bodies. And to that end, the Council develops collateral like best practices, use cases, does some standard gaps analysis, etc. And over the past 4 years, the Council has grown to over 500 member companies, and the collateral that the CSEC has delivered since its inception is highlighted on the chart. And at the bottom is a sort of a preliminary list of projects that the CSEC is working on this year. And of course, the security white paper is the focus of today's webinar. I would certainly encourage folks who are interested in any of these topics to consider joining the appropriate working group and engaging either as a contributor or a reviewer. The time commitment is fairly minimal, and I can tell you that everyone I worked with on a project has had a very positive experience. So Tracy, let's move to the next chart. So this chart highlights the key changes that were made to the paper in the version 2 revision. The high-level flow of the paper stayed the same, but each of the major sections actually underwent, you know, some change. The cloud security landscape section was actually updated to address additional risks that have gained attention over the past couple of years. The 10 steps that comprise the cloud security guidance section remain the same, but changes were made to each of the steps to reflect current best practices. And one particular area of focus for the version 2 update was privacy. We added one appendix that explains the differences between security and privacy, and we added another appendix that highlights the key privacy regulations that are gaining momentum around the world. And then, you know, as you'd expect, references to new cloud standards like ISO 27017 and 27018 were added, along with references to several CSEC white papers that were published in the past 2 years. And so with that as background, the remainder of the presentation takes you through sort of a tour of the white paper and its recommendations. So Tracy, let's move to chart 4. So this chart highlights the security risks that require special attention in a cloud computing environment. The paper covers each of these risks in detail, and I'll touch on just a few of them. So governance is obviously critical. In public cloud deployments, customers cede control to their cloud provider over a number of issues that may affect security. If responsibility isn't clearly established between the customer and the provider, there's potential for vital parts of security defenses to be compromised. In addition, customers are now reliant on providers for key security compliance and certification, which of course introduces risk. Questions like what level of visibility does the provider allow into its security control? Does it permit audits? And if a security breach does occur, how will the provider manage it and notify customers? Application and data protection present unique challenges in cloud environments. Delegating infrastructure security to a provider requires customers to apply more controls at the user, application, and data level. From a data perspective, it may be difficult for customers to effectively check the data handling practices of their provider, especially in cases where there's multiple transfers of data between federated cloud services. And then, of course, there's always the risk of incomplete data deletion when the contract with the provider is terminated. Malicious behavior of insiders is certainly compounded in the cloud, since malicious activity might occur in the customer organization or the provider organization, or both for that matter. And then there's added risk that the provider may go out of business, resulting in essential business services being unavailable for an extended period of time. So the bottom line is that the customer is ultimately responsible for the security and privacy impact on their business. And as a result, it's critical that customers verify that all their security requirements are addressed in the cloud services agreement that's established with the provider. If a provider is unable or unwilling to satisfy these security requirements in a binding contract, then it's wise for customers to continue searching until a provider who will address those requirements are found. So Tracy, let's move to chart 5. So this chart highlights the 10 steps that cloud customers should take to evaluate and manage the security of their cloud services. The ultimate goal is to mitigate risk and deliver an appropriate level of security to support the business. And this 10-step guidance is really the core of the white paper. And so the charts that follow are going to cover each of these steps in detail. So Tracy, let's move to chart 6. So most organizations have security and compliance policies and procedures that are used to protect intellectual property and corporate assets. And so step 1 of the roadmap focuses on leveraging these principles and policies to create an effective governance, risk, and compliance model for security that covers both on-prem and cloud environments. And so as part of the transition to cloud, it's critical that customers understand their level of risk tolerance and then focus on mitigating the risks that are most important to their business. Before migrating apps or data to a cloud environment, it's certainly important that customers understand the specific laws and regulations that apply, along with the relevant obligations imposed on both themselves and the provider. So data retention requirements, data protection requirements, disclosure requirements to authorities, etc., have got to be adequately addressed. And from a general governance perspective, cloud providers should certainly notify customers about the occurrence of any breach of their system, regardless of the parties or data that's directly impacted. The provider should stop the breach, restore secure access to the service as soon as possible, and certainly make changes to ensure that the breach doesn't recur. And as I've mentioned on the previous chart, the primary means that the customers have to ensure their apps and data hosted in the cloud are secured in accordance with their security and compliance policies is to verify that the cloud service agreement contains all of their requirements. Again, if a suitable agreement isn't provided, then the customer should seek the services of a different provider. And one useful approach to compliance is for a cloud provider to certify against an established set of security controls and standards. Certification certainly gives customers more confidence in the provider, and it gives customers the ability to demonstrate sort of due diligence, right, in the selection process. Some of the widely recognized standards for information security compliance are highlighted on the chart, and then depending on industry and specific business requirements, cloud customers are certainly encouraged to seek official certification from their provider for one or more of these standards. We'll cover each of these standards in a bit more detail as we go through the remaining steps of the roadmap. And so with that, what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Claude Baudoin, who will take us through steps 2 through 5. Claude, over to you.
Thank you, John. The segue to what you just said is paraphrasing a past president of the U.S., trust but verify. So you've established a certain number of governance principles in order to ensure that you're going to govern the information correctly and the relationship correctly between you, the customer, and the provider of the cloud service. But now you need to verify that everything is in place to do this correctly. So step 2 is about auditing the operational and the business processes of the cloud provider. Either the provider has already put in place an audit mechanism and is using a reliable third-party technical auditing firm and is publishing the results of those audits and sharing them with all their customers, or if they do not, then you as their customer have a responsibility to make sure that those security audits are carried out, and you need to obtain the agreement of the provider to allow this audit to be performed. Audits need to follow approved or reliable methods, and they should and to apply these methods correctly, they should rely on existing standards for security controls, and then they should be carried out by people who have the skills to do so, which means that even if you are asking your provider to lend themselves to a custom security audit for you, you may still need to hire a third party to do it because they know the standards and they have the right people. So this is a fairly formal step, and it is usually necessary, again, unless the provider has already performed the right security audits and is making the results available to you, and those results are reasonably recent. This audit should probably be repeated once a year, at most once every 2 years by the provider or by their customers. The areas on which the audit should focus is what are the internal controls that the provider has put in place to ensure a certain number of things, such as the fact that various customers are properly isolated from each other if this is a multi-tenant environment, and also ensure that the staff of the provider, the system administrators, the management of the provider or company have limited privileges, so that just from the fact that they work for that provider, that does not give them unlimited access to all the information, which is the customer's information. You also need to make sure that there is correct event logging and audit trails, and that you have access to them in order to do forensic analysis in case anything happens, and you have to be able to monitor the usage of all the services hosted in the cloud. Next slide, please. So step 3 continues with this idea that you have to manage people and access. So the identity and access management, or IDAM, aspect of things needs to be even more strict in this provider environment, because you have provider personnel, you have your own personnel as one of the users of the cloud, you have personnel from other companies that are using the same service, and identifying the people who log in to any aspect of the provided service and making sure that their access is controlled properly is therefore absolutely critical. On the right-hand side of the chart, you can see some of the standards that may need to be applied, or that typically will need to be applied. Fortunately, there are now enough capabilities for access management based on directories and on security profiles, as well as federated identity systems that allow the cloud provider to support, for instance, federated identity management, which means that they inherit the access control rules that you have yourself on premise, delegated user administration, single sign-on to avoid the proliferation of passwords and identities, potentially identifications through 2 or 3 factor systems. So these identity and access management systems need to be strong, they need to be reliable, they need to be auditable, they need to be monitored. Every access, every login should be recorded and kept, and therefore the customers will, as part of the auditing process, be able to understand what has been the usage of the services, which will allow them to comply with their risk and regulatory compliance constraints. Next step, please. So in step 4, we now move from having ensured that the infrastructure as a whole possesses all the characteristics needed to implement protection, to actually implementing the protection of the data and information. And there are additional standards and rules. In particular, you have the ISO 27017 standard, but you have things as basic as SSL for the encryption of web traffic and the confidentiality of that web traffic, IPsec, FIPS, and OASIS that have published relevant standards that should be followed. So there we need to distinguish between what happens to the data at rest, meaning when it is stored and not being used, as well as the data in motion between the user, who is an employee of the customer, and the site where the data is stored at the cloud provider. The customer, you need to inventory your data. You need to categorize your data according to all its potential levels of confidentiality, and you need to associate with those levels of confidentiality the actions that a user is allowed to take. Can a certain type of data be transmitted in the clear? Does it need to be encrypted? Should it not be transmitted at all for extremely confidential data? That means you might not want to put it in the cloud, or you have to have really strong encryption. You need to consider all forms of data, remembering that if you use platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, you may be moving not only information, but you may be moving application images across a link in order to load them in the cloud environment. These application images are also secure information that needs to be protected. And then you apply the identity and access management principles and rules so that the access to the data is not just to the systems, is limited according to the privileges associated with the roles and responsibility of each actor in your organization. There's even some research being done right now about how to keep data encrypted until the very last moment when a record is being read into an application. This is still immature, but at least encrypting the data when it is stored and encrypting it in transit over the internet are the two basic things that you need to ensure are applied. Let's go to step 5 now. So this is something that is relatively new now in this version of the guide. We have devoted more attention to privacy, and you will see in a few weeks that the CSEC is going to publish another guide related to privacy in the public sector. So privacy is obviously something that has become very important. We've all seen how it's been challenged by various data breaches, including at retail companies. We also see how the concern about access by various government entities to private information has become a key concern over the last 2-3 years, which is why we've added a stronger emphasis to this domain, on this domain in this new version of the security guide. So we're talking here about data protection and the protection of PII, which means personally identifiable information. And there is obviously laws and regulations that require a PII controller, which is the company that is the custodian of the or the owner of the data, to protect it on behalf of the person to whom that data belongs, like your health records or your financial records. And access to PII must be identified and must be limited. PII data needs to be correctly identified. Not all data is privately identifiable, but certainly a lot of data is, especially in healthcare, finance, e-government. So it needs to be identified, and then it needs to be stored securely, which overlaps with some of the encryption requirements we've just seen in the previous step. And again, access to PII needs to be limited to authorized users, which refers back to identity and access management. Privacy issues should be addressed in the agreement between the provider and the supplier, the provider and the customer, sorry, of the cloud service. And historically, during the first generation of service agreements between cloud providers and cloud customers, the agreements only talked about the private information of the signatories to the contract, not the people whose data was stored in the application or in the cloud storage. And this needs to be reinforced very strongly in order to give the cloud provider the obligation to protect the privacy of the information they store. And then there needs to be, again, monitoring of the compliance to these obligations. There is a multiplicity of standards. You can see some on the right-hand side. Obviously, in the U.S., access to medical records is governed by HIPAA. You have work that's been done by NIST. And then the European Union actually has very strict data protection rules, and even U.S. providers need to be careful whether they are in compliance with those rules when they store information that pertains to citizens and residents of the European Union. And then there are safe harbor policies that allow the storage of personal information outside of the European Union and conversely outside of the U.S., but only if the harboring country has protections that are as strong as those of the country from which the people whose information is kept are coming from. So this is a complex landscape of regulations and laws, and you need to learn about those and apply them to protect the data. So that being said, we're going to turn to step 6, and I'm going to ask Chris Dotson to take over.
Great, thank you, Claude. So step 6 is to assess the security provisions for cloud applications, which really means that you need to be clear on who is responsible for security at each layer of the solution. The top bullet is really important here. I think everyone on the call probably already knows this, but there's no magic fairy dust in cloud that will take an application that's not secure on a traditional deployment and make it secure when you put it on cloud. But depending on the deployment model, the provider may do some things for you. From an application security perspective, when you're using an infrastructure as a service, there's not a whole lot different from a traditional deployment. The provider will take care of the security of the underlying infrastructure, like the network switches or hypervisors, but from an application perspective, you still need to do everything. When you're using a platform as a service offering, the provider will usually handle the security for the middleware products, the operating systems, a lot of the underlying platform that the application is built on. So that takes quite a bit off of your plate as a customer, but you will still be responsible for the application security. So any SQL injection attacks are still on you. Any other types of attacks on the application itself or how it handles data. When you're using software as a service, the customer is generally responsible for putting only the correct data classifications on the service. As Claude said a couple of slides back, it's important to know, to classify your data and know what's going where. Some services may not be suitable for all types of data. And the customer may also have the responsibility for some of the configuration settings on the software as a service, like levers to flip on when to use encryption, how to authenticate users, the management of users on the service, those types of things. Even in a software as a service, you as the customer still have to take care of those things. However, your responsibilities are certainly less the further up that stack you move. The important thing here is to make sure that someone, either the customer or the provider, is meeting the security requirements at each level, from physical security all the way up to application and data security. So on to step 7. Step 7 is about network security, ensuring that cloud networks and connections are secure. In the paper, we use the analogy of a hotel. The cloud provider is like a hotel and might have a certain amount of perimeter security, not just letting anyone into the hotel who isn't a guest there, and has a much stronger requirement to keep the guests of the hotel separate from one another, using walls and doors, for example. As with most security, network security is concerned largely with confidentiality, integrity, and availability. From a confidentiality and integrity standpoint, the cloud provider may offer some private areas, like private VLANs. In those cases, an attacker shouldn't be able to get into those private areas and monitor or change the data going across. From an availability standpoint, distributed denial of service attacks are relatively common. So if you think you might be subject to some of those, you should certainly ask if the provider has means to deal with those. There are also services you can get. You can layer other cloud services in some cases to help deal with those. On network, external network requirements, you typically want to have some way to screen traffic, commonly a firewall. And you may want to have some mechanism to monitor the traffic going through, like an IDS and IPS. There are also next-generation firewalls, as they're named, that they'll do both of these in one device. They're not necessarily separate devices. Many cloud providers do offer those types of devices for use in your deployment. So as a customer, you should be sure that what the cloud provider offers meets your requirements in that area. And logging and notification are definitely important so that you know when something does happen. Customers should make sure that they can get the logs in a way that they can consume and analyze. From an internal network requirement, I already mentioned that the provider has to keep its customers separate in some way. In addition, providers should certainly protect their own networks, and often providers will conduct periodic testing of their internal controls and monitoring. So you can look at an attestation to see, for example, that the provider did test its controls. And now I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Chris.
Mike?
So moving on to step 8. One of the things that you have to be concerned with as a cloud service customer is the security controls on physical infrastructure and facilities, not of your data center, but of the cloud service provider's data center. You've got to make sure that the cloud service provider is doing the right thing in terms of their own physical infrastructure, that their facilities are in a secure area. You need to be assured that they have appropriate protection against external and environmental threats, things like flooding, power failures, and so on. Because any of those sort of things happening to your cloud provider's data center are going to hit your services. You need to be assured about the cloud service personnel who are in working areas of the cloud data center you're using, and that they have appropriate security controls on the equipment in there. So, for example, disks containing your data can't get removed from the data center and misused. There need to be appropriate controls on supporting utilities, power, water, telecommunications. You need to be sure that those things aren't going to be easily damaged. And there needs to be control on things like cabling. There needs to be a proper schedule of equipment maintenance so that you don't experience outages due to equipment being present in the provider's data center that's going to fail just because it didn't maintain properly. And there needs to be very careful control over the removal and disposal of any assets. For example, there could be disks or backup tapes, for example, that will contain your data, and if they're not disposed of in a secure way, then that's potentially your data going out the door. There needs to be human resource security, for example, confidentiality agreements on the staff of the data center that the cloud provider is using. And you would like to see that there are appropriate disaster recovery and business continuity plans in place so that if there is a problem of any kind, that the cloud service provider is going to be able to deal with it. Now, it's not normally the case that you as a cloud service customer would actually go in and verify that all these things are being done in the cloud provider's data center. Instead, you will rely on one or other of the certification schemes which involve third-party auditors going in and checking out the cloud service provider's systems and equipment and making sure that they're doing all the right things in these areas. One of the best-known certification schemes for this is the 27001 scheme, and 27017 standard at ISO is the one that then encompasses all these requirements for cloud service providers. But there are others. CSA and some of the other certification schemes offer similar kinds of assurance that if they have the appropriate certification, then you know the right things being done in all these physical and environmental areas. Moving on to step 9 on the next slide. One of the big items when you're dealing with cloud services is that what you're buying as the cloud service is really all defined in the cloud service agreement that exists between you and the cloud service provider. In many cases, that might be a kind of fixed agreement. You just sign up for the service, pay with your credit card, and you get whatever's declared ahead of time for that particular cloud service. But in other cases, particularly the more highly valued services, you may actually negotiate over the terms of the cloud service agreement so you can get exactly the terms you want. But either way, you're going to be concerned about the terms relating to security and privacy that turn up in the cloud service agreement, because they are your guarantees about the privacy and security aspects of the cloud service. One aspect of that is that any security clauses you find in the cloud service agreement should not only apply to the cloud provider, but there should be guarantees that if the cloud service provider uses any subcontractors, the cloud providers, to provide aspects of their service, that the same terms, the same clauses apply to those peer providers as well as to the cloud service provider you're directly dealing with. You should check to make sure that the agreement documents the provider must notify the customer of any breach of their system, whether it directly affects the customer's data or not. Because there can be reputational damage, even if your data isn't lost, if someone else's data is lost or broken into. So you need to be aware of any problems that the provider has in relation to the security of their systems. You should be checking that the cloud service agreement has appropriate metrics for the performance and the effectiveness of information security management, not just the service itself, or having managed the service in security terms. So you should be looking for metrics relating to that in reporting things that are going on, in providing mechanisms for you to allow you as a customer to check on information security of your service. And you should certainly be looking to have compliance reports to communicate strengths and indeed weaknesses of the controls, services and mechanisms that the provider has in place to enable you to understand how well their services are performing in security and privacy protection terms. Moving on to step 10, our final step. And this is where we decide as a customer to leave a particular cloud service or cloud service provider, stop using their services. We should not forget that this is an important part of the use of the cloud service, often called the exit process. And in essence, when you, as a customer, decide to leave a cloud service, you should expect that all your stuff, all your material, all your data will be removed from the cloud service in a timely and organized fashion, so that by the time you've completely finished using the service, then no data, none of your data should be residing with the cloud service provider when the exit process is complete. And you should be requiring the provider to cleanse as much as possible, not only of your data, your customer data, but also of stuff relating to logs and audit information, where they're allowed to. That's not always allowed by jurisdictions, legal requirements to retain some records of that kind, but in general you should be looking to have all your activities forgotten about effectively by the cloud service provider. But while providing for all those removal of data type capabilities, you need to worry about you getting a smooth transition from the period when you're using the service actively to when you've terminated. For example, while you're doing the transition, you expect backups of your data to still be retained until effectively you've notified that, okay, I've got all the copies of my data, I'm happy now, I've got them back in my own environment, I don't need you, Mr. Cloud Provider, to keep hold of them. Now you can delete the backup copies. That kind of organized process is something you need to have in place as part of the exit process overall. Okay, so that completes our 10 steps. So if we move on to the next slide, that gets us into the summary. I think it's important to recognize that cloud computing can actually have a very positive impact on security and privacy for customer organizations. Most cloud providers have excellent skills in security and privacy. They're able to spread those skills across a large number of customers, so everyone benefits from the skills they're able to bring to bear. And that may, in fact, enable you to improve the security and privacy for your applications and data when you start to use cloud services. However, we have to recognize that because of the split between the customer organization and the cloud service provider organization, cloud computing has unique security and privacy challenges that have to be addressed, and you need, as a customer, to be assured that they are being addressed. It should be absolutely clear to everyone that cloud security and privacy is actually a joint responsibility between the customers and the providers. When you as a customer use a cloud service, you're not just abdicating your responsibility off to the provider. You still have some security responsibilities on your plate, and you need to be very clear about which ones you still have and that they're being exercised correctly. And you need to be very careful that everything is properly described in the cloud service agreement to reflect that split of responsibilities. So, to finish off, just a few words about the CSEC, Cloud Standards Customer Council. You're welcome to join the Cloud Standards Customer Council right now. You can help shape some of the white papers and other material that's being produced by the CSEC, and that can enable your perspectives as a customer to be reflected in future white papers and in future standards, because much of the material that's produced by the CSEC is also given to the major standards-making bodies as a way of reflecting cloud service customer perspectives and concerns, which sometimes could get lost sight of without an organization like CSEC. You're welcome to join one or more of the CSEC working groups, and there are some links on this chart if you need to find those. And then we'll finish off with a final chart, which is a set of resources you can go find if you're not familiar with the many fine pieces of work that the CSEC has produced on whole different aspects of cloud computing. They're listed on this page, starting with our Security for Cloud Computing white paper right through the practical guide to cloud computing, migrating applications to public cloud services, and so on. All good reading, and you're most welcome to go read them. Well, that brings us to the close of our presentation today, and that means it's question time. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask.
Thank you, Mike, and everyone for your time today. Just want to mention that this presentation will be posted to our website this afternoon. That's cloud-council.org. And tomorrow I'll be sending an email to everyone that registered for the webinar with a link to this presentation and to the white paper so you can review. We do have a couple questions. We have a little time if you'd like to stick around. First question is, what's the status of ISO 27017 and 27018?
So, Mike, do you want to take the lead on that?
Mike would.
Yeah,
I'll let you handle that one.
Mike Edwards pins with this because he's one of the guys actually on the committees working on both of these specifications. 27018, which is the handling the data protection for PII, or sometimes called privacy, that was completed towards the back end of last year. It was actually published and out the door. And in fact, some cloud services have now been tagged as being compliant with 27.18, so it's got as far as that. You can actually find some services in the marketplace that are marked as compliant with 27.18, so that's not only a standard that's good and useful, but it's out there and being used actively now. 27.17, which is the security for cloud computing, that is in its final stages at ISO and should be published in the fall of this year. That's my expectation. It's taken longer. There's been some interesting debates within the ISO committee dealing with 27.17 about how far it should go, and that's why it's taken a bit longer than the privacy handling 27.18. But we should see it later this year, and then hopefully sometime early next year we'll have the first cloud services also being certified against as being conform with 27.17. Thanks. That's a good question.
Thanks, Mike. Next question. Do security controls and commitments included in cloud service agreements vary widely from provider to provider?
So this is John. Why don't I take maybe the first crack at that, and then others can sort of jump in. So yeah, in fact, the security commitments do vary quite significantly from provider to provider, and are dependent upon a number of things. Certainly service model and deployment model are factors. As I think Chris mentioned earlier, for infrastructure as a service, customers are responsible for a larger percentage of security controls, while the reverse is true for software as a service. And so that will certainly be reflected in the service agreements. And then, of course, the security commitments for cloud providers are much stronger for private deployments than public cloud deployments. And then there are also providers that target specific industries like healthcare, financial services, public services, etc. And the service agreements for these providers will typically be stronger and include specific certifications for standards like HIPAA and PCI DSS, in order to be considered by companies in these industries.
Yeah, and this is Chris, and I'll add to that exactly what you said. I think they do differ quite a bit just because the cloud services out there differ a lot. I mean, there are some, they're effectively unmanaged services. There are some managed services. Obviously, what they're providing is considerably different. I haven't seen a lot of like a standardized template or anything for cloud service agreements. They do tend to be, there's definitely some common areas, but they do tend to be fairly different because what the provider is providing is quite different.
Thank you, Chris and John. Let's see, where can one find a complete list of security standards that are relevant to cloud computing?
So I can take a cut at that, and it's actually on this chart. So there is a companion paper to the paper that we just covered, and it's the second one on this list, the Cloud Security Standards, What to Expect and What to Negotiate. This paper actually provides a fairly comprehensive list of all the relevant security standards for cloud computing, and it provides guidance to customers on what to negotiate and what to expect from their cloud providers. So I would certainly recommend that folks visit the CSEC website or go directly to the paper using this URL. I think you'd find it very useful.
Thank you, John. What are some of the key differences between security and privacy?
I can take a crack at that unless somebody else wants to. I think, to me, privacy is a lot more about the type of information you collect and use, and security is about keeping that safe. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But in a nutshell, that's the way I see it. So if you have a security breach, it could also lead to, a breach of privacy. But if you're not collecting specific data at all, then in a breach it can't be lost.
Yeah, this is Claude. I would add that conversely, you can have privacy breaches that are not due to a security problem per se, or they're just because of casual or casual access to information, for instance, because you don't have a good enough access management policy. So you may be exposing private information to certain people in the organization who do not have a need to know it, and that's potentially a breach of privacy, even though your security infrastructure is theoretically fine and you never had an attack. You just had people exposed to information they shouldn't have seen. We've actually taken we've made the effort at the CSEC to define a more clear table of the difference between privacy and security, and we're including it now in a couple of different papers. So we describe this in this paper that we've been talking about today, but there is a guide to privacy in the public sector that's going to come out that also contains that definition that exactly answers the person's question.
Yeah, and then the only other thing I'd add is that if you've got a significant enough chunk of private data, sometimes that increases your security requirements. One person's name and email address is not, not something you have to particularly secure that much. If you have 80 million of them, though, even though that data is mostly publicly available, it kind of gains some additional weight by having so much of it in one place. So you also kind of have to look sometimes not just at what type of data you have, but the quantity of personally identifiable information.
This is Shamoon chiming in. Just piggybacking upon the others, I wanted to make a comment. We have various standards development organizations, and another one besides the cloud standards customer council is NIST. And NIST actually felt a real key driver for the new security controls, the 853-Rev4, was a new privacy controls family, to the fact that we felt that I was on that committee, and part of what happened was that there was a need to separate privacy from security. So once again, one of the key determinants, and that will be in the NIST paperwork, the NIST security controls family, there was a whole new family of privacy controls added, and that will also be touched upon in the CSEC privacy white paper.
Thank you for mentioning that. Looks like I think we could take one more question. What are the key requirements and standards for integrating security across on-premises and cloud environments?
Well, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, would anyone like to take a crack
okay.
at that one?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it.
Sure.
So, if you're dealing with on-prem and cloud environments, in a lot of cases, you may just be extending your own organization's security requirements out to the cloud, and so you'll need to make sure that your cloud provider can do all the things that your internal policy needs. You may decide to split it also, but in a lot of cases, it seems like that you're in those types of hybrid environments, you're just taking your own internal security policy and using it everywhere, both on premises and on the shared cloud environments.
Mike Edwards here. I think there are probably some key technologies you need to give some thought to that will help you with the integration. One of the ones that I tend to look at early on is the whole question of how ID and access management is being done.
Yeah.
And in the ideal situation, you want to use the same ID and access management facilities for the on-prem and for the cloud environment. And so, if for example, you have an existing ID and access management system for your on-premises stuff, you'd like to be able to use that for the cloud services as well. So you don't have to go replicating IDs and stuff around the place. That'll make it a lot easier to integrate and to do a single point of control for all your users. That's one of the sort of important operational aspects you'd like to simplify as much as possible.
Great. Thank you, Mike and Chris, and everyone that could join us today. Again, the presentation will be posted to our website this afternoon, and I'll be sending an email around with a link to download this and the white paper. In the meantime, if you're not already a member of the Cloud Standards Customer Council, you're welcome to join, and please join us for future events. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.